Today, I'm going to be looking at your comments and your questions. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Well, hello, viewers and listeners. I'm Nathan Jacobs. Welcome to Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Today is going to be a little more casual than usual, mainly because I'm just looking at your comments and questions, right? Things that have shown up on the various platforms and whatnot. So we'll see. We'll see what's coming at me. I don't quite know. So this is actually a prelude for folks who watch or listen to this podcast. We are planning on at some point here doing these sort of live Q&A sessions. But since we're just starting out and growing our viewer base, right, we thought we'd start by actually drawing in, various questions from folks that have been rolling in, whether it's on, Instagram or it's on, YouTube or some other platform, and bring them here to be fielded by me live, before your very eyes. So let's see what we've got coming at us. So these have been sent to me by my producer. I just full disclosure, I do not read all the comments, right? Those I pop in every now and then. I'll see some things there. Folks will draw my attention to them. People text me things and whatnot. So that all happens. But I don't scour all the comments. So in many ways, these are going to be fresh, right? I don't necessarily know what's coming at me as I look at this. So let's read these off and see if I've got any thoughts for you. Okay. So this first one that I see here is actually was apparently posted in response to the most important question. So that's the inaugural episode. The most important question, for those who haven't watched that episode, that's an episode where what I looked at is I made my case that the most important question in the history of ideas is the question of realism versus nominalism. And this is a philosophical question that has to do with the fact that you and I and everybody else look out into the world, we see structures, genera, species, common properties, things like that. And the big question is, does the mind identify those structures because those are real and they're out there? That's just the nature of reality. And if you say that, you're a realist. Or are they just names, right? The mind needs to organize all this stuff. And so even though those structures aren't real, the mind comes up with organizational structures, and it's called nominalism, from the Latin nomen, for name. And so it's just a bunch of names that we put out there and impose on the world, but the world's not really that way. And I made the case that that's like the critical fork in the road. That fork in the road explains, that one way of looking at the history of ideas is just, sort of two different roads in answer to that one question. And I work through how you see the realist road unfold on the one hand, and then how the nominalist road, which emerges pretty early on, right, pre-Socratic, but sort of dies off and then is resuscitated in modernity, well, late medieval scholasticism and then into modernity. I talked that through and the fruit of that, and offered that sort of narrative picture, and then suggested that that's really important to where we are in culture today, that's an undercurrent that's still there. Some people who operate according to sort of realist instincts, and other people who have more nominalist instincts. And I wanted to draw that to light because I thought that's a really helpful thing to have in your mind, when you're looking at a lot of these sort of cultural divides. And if we could recognize that, we could get down to those sort of more foundational issues of what the real issue behind the issue sort of is. So there you go, prelude. I've got one question that's been sent my way with regard to that. So what about the idea of God creating a boulder so large that he couldn't move it? Okay, there's no innate contradiction there. Okay, this is I know this is a sort of question that some people will probably look at and they'll snicker and be like, I can't believe somebody actually asked that. Can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? It's actually a good question. I think George Mavrodes wrote an article on this once. It's a short essay. Obviously, there's not a ton to exposit with regard to it, but I think it's good to go ahead and tackle some of these questions. Now, by way of context, for folks who maybe haven't seen that episode, one of the things that I talked about is that one of the things that occasioned nominalism in late medieval scholasticism was the fact that there were realists had a tendency to say that there are certain things God can't do. Now, that needs to be qualified, heavily qualified, right? So, for example, God can't make square circles. Now, people hear that and they kind of get weirded out. They're like, well, I thought God could do anything. He's omnipotent, right? All powerful. And so what do you mean there's certain things that God can't do? And what a realist means when they say that, they're not saying that there's this thing out there, square circle, that, God just lacks the juice to be able to bring about, right? If only he was just a little bit more powerful, maybe he could give us square circles. Instead, what the realists claim is that whenever we talk about possibilities God might bring about, you need to first offer a possible thing. And square circles, right, the basic level for a possible thing is that it's coherent, right? That it lacks contradiction. So when you posit a square circle, you're actually putting together a bunch of words that contradict themselves. It's incoherent, right? So you're saying a two-dimensional geometric shape with four sides, four right angles, equal length, sides. But it also doesn't have four sides. It doesn't have right angles. The sides aren't equal length because, it has a flowing circumference on which all points are an equal distance from a common century. Like, those are all words you can string together, but it's nonsensical gobbledygook, right? And so the realists, when they say God can't do that, they're not saying like there's a thing I'm pointing to. That thing he can't do. What they're saying is the words you strung together are meaningless, right? So you haven't offered a thing for God to do, and that's why God can't do that semantic nonsense, right, that you're offering up. And so here the question is focused on the question of like, well, what about a rock that's so big that he couldn't move it? There's no inherent contradiction in there. Or is there? So actually, I would suggest that here, a rock so big God can't lift it actually is as nonsensical as square circles. And so we can see this in a couple of different ways. The one is that when you're talking about an object, well, there's a few different ways we can approach this, right? So one would be the sort of medieval causal principle that suggests that an effect cannot exceed its cause, right? So medieval realists would probably first appeal to that. The idea that effects are sort of capped, their possibilities are capped by their causes. And so the idea that somehow a rock would be so big that God can't lift it, you're talking about an effect that exceeds its causes, and they would suggest that there's an inherent incoherence there already. The other possibility here in terms of, response is the fact that omnipotence, right, all powerful, actually means something, whose power can't be exceeded, right? So you actually are positing a contradiction, right? Can a being whose power can't be exceeded produce something that exceeds its power, right? And right there, you're actually positing a contradiction. And it's a contradiction that's in keeping with this other sort of causal principle. And so the idea of a boulder that exceeds the bounds of omnipotence, right, actually is already sort of moving into contradictory territory. Now, the other possibility here, and this is another interesting thing, is that there's also this other principle that I think is rather interesting here. Sorry, I'm getting sleep out of my eye. That'll go live on the internet. That's great. So the other thing is that sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what the omnis actually mean in classical metaphysics. And people tend to think of God's intelligence, God's power, God's wisdom, whatever, as univocal with that of creatures, meaning it's the same type. It's just more, right? And so they start to think of like, I have a certain type of a quantity of power and God just has a lot more of it, right? But in classical metaphysics, God, at least in the sort of Judeo-Christian concept of God as like the greatest possible being, or the sort of being that the omnis apply to, It's actually not thought of as univocal, the same type. It's thought of as categorically different, right? So even when we talk about knowing, right, there is a certain type of knowing that we have, for example, that's susceptible to doubt, that's fallible, and so on and so forth. And so part of the classical assumption is that God's type of knowing is categorically different. It's also categorically different because there's a certain passivity with regard to our knowledge. Certain type of discovery of a reality that's out there that's not causally originating from us, whereas with God, that's not the case either. So anyway, there are all these sorts of metaphysical reasons why God's power, God's knowing, God's presence is something that analogically is similar to ours, right? We have a concept of knowing, and so we can think sort of by analogy what it's like to know something or what it's like to have power or something like that and do something comparative. But that's ultimately anthropomorphic because God's sort of knowing and power and things like that are categorically different. Now, why do I bring that up? I bring that up because let's just pretend for a minute that we're thinking about God's power for making rocks, right? Boulders. So we start to say, well, what is lost, right, in our concept of God? What is, if we start to say that there is a limit, right? Like that God can't do this, right? We're saying that God can't make that type of boulder, right? Like, what is lost? Now, obviously, the answer would be, well, we've in some way diminished God's boulder making capacity. And the question is, well, like, have we really? In answering no, right, to this question, has that in some ways diminished God's boulder making capacity? And I think the answer is no, because what you're actually seeing here, and this will illuminate the point I'm looking to make. Let's say it's like, well, this boulder God could make, but then his power is sufficient to lift it. Okay, so we make a bigger boulder. Okay. And then his power, though, is actually able to keep up with that. Oh, well, we make a bigger boulder, and his power is able to keep up with that. And so this becomes sort of the problem, right? If that's really a problem. The fact of the matter is, if you're starting to move forward and you're just increase, and there's no limit, right? Then what we run into is no matter how big the boulder is, God's capacity to lift it is sort of there. What we start to see is we actually have an infinite, not in a true infinite, right, like unbounded, but infinite in the sense that you can just keep on going and going and going in terms of the size of the boulder that God can make, and then his boulder lifting capacity. So we actually haven't placed a limit on the boulder, right, because quantitatively there's just an ever increasing size that becomes possible. Now, what if the respondent then says, no, this is an infinite boulder. Like it's not that it has a bounded nature that just keeps on growing. It's like we're going to have an infinite boulder. And this is where I think it starts to illuminate the problem with, the question being posed. Once you actually say an unbounded boulder, right, a true infinite where it has no boundaries, I'm not sure we're talking about a boulder anymore, right? Because boulders are finite things, right? They have certain definite properties. Whereas when we're talking about God, we're not talking about a quantitative increase of power. We're talking about something unbounded. And so this is actually what I think the real issue is here, that when we're talking about omnipotence, we're talking about something that's unbounded. Whereas whenever you're talking about an object, be it a boulder or, a human being or a triangle or whatever, you're talking about something bounded, right? Something that has finite properties. Something that is, to use the sort of Greek terms, like it's paragroptos. You can draw a line around it, whereas God is paragroptos, right? You can't draw a line around him. And in this sense, I think this is where you really get into the true sort of metaphysical contradiction that's present within this point, which is that if you were to actually try to create an unbounded boulder, right, something that matched God's unboundedness, you wouldn't have a boulder. Because boulders are finite objects, right? They have boundary lines. And so in this sense, to talk about an unbounded boulder, an a paragroptos boulder, is to actually insert a contradiction in terms, similar to saying, a two-dimensional geometric object with four sides that doesn't have four sides because it has a flowing circumference. You're into the sort of semantic gobbledygook. And so I think whether you're talking about the contradiction that emerges from an effect that exceeds its cause, or you're talking about, a omnipotent being that, an all-powerful being whose power can be exceeded, or you're talking about a boulder that somehow is unbounded, right? I think all of those different formulations about what a boulder would be, right? This thing that we're talking about that God can't lift, I think all of those fall into some form of contradiction. And so the answer is actually there is a contradiction. There's several contradictions in the proposition. And so that's why, the realist, I as a realist would say like, no, God can't make such a thing because such a thing isn't actually a thing, right? It's semantic nonsense. It's gobbledygook. There is a contradiction there. So there you go. Okay. Question number 1 down. Let's see what else we've got here. So this is in response to the Essence Energies interview. Oh, so I did an interview with David Bradshaw, good friend of mine, former colleague of mine at University of Kentucky. And we also went to church together at St. Athanasius Church in Kentucky. And I interviewed David because David is an excellent scholar. He's a great philosopher, and he has done a lot of work on this essence energies distinction. And for those who aren't familiar with it, you can listen to that entire podcast. The basic concept is that there's a distinction between the nature of a thing and the operative powers that express or articulate that nature. So, for example, there's a distinction between mind and the abstract, and then the operative powers are the energies of mind by which it articulates itself, right? So right now, I'm speaking, right? Those are the energies or operative powers of mind. Or similarly, there's a distinction between the essence of fire, right? Fire per se, and the operative powers and the energies of fire, of heating and lighting. And then that distinction ends up being critical to a variety of things in the ancient world. It becomes a critical distinction in terms of, for, Jews and then Christians, it becomes a critical way of describing how God is one thing that doesn't change, and yet he expresses himself in a variety of ways, free expressions of himself. That's how divine freedom is talked about. It also becomes critical to the concept that there's transference, right? So with this distinction, to use fire again, a favorite analogy was the idea that you can take iron and stick it in fire and it glows and it burns and all this sort of stuff, and you take it out and it's still metal, but it has the operative powers of fire within it. And so that concept of transference, the idea that energies might be transferable in certain ways, became critical to how a lot of ancient people understood things like demoniacs, right? How they understood, participation, or prophets, right? People who participate in the operative powers of God, right? As well as relics, holy places, all these sorts of things. So David and I explore that entire essence energies distinction at length in that interview, if you're curious about that. So let's see. We've got what looks like 2 questions here under this one, or comments. I don't even know if these are questions or comments, so we'll see. So let's see. First comment, question, let's see. Let's see if we push one of the analogies a little too far. Okay, I'll be curious which analogy this is. When I hum the St. Matthew Passion, am I participating in Bach's energies? Oh, just kidding about pushing the analogy too far. That's an honest question I have. All right. This is actually probably prompted because I actually use Bach, I think, in that interview. I will oftentimes use by way of analogy when I'm talking about the distinction between sort of the abstract nature and the operative powers that exude from it. I'll sometimes use Bach or some other musician as an analogy, where it's like, if I sat there and I told you like, hey, Bach, I've got this guy here, Bach, he's a great, musician, creative, genius, all this sort of stuff. And you'd be like, well, I hear the words that you're saying, they mean something to me, right? Creativity, genius, music, I got all that sort of stuff, but I don't really know, right? And the best way for you to get to know, and I can't peer into Bach's chest, right, to see the sort of abstract creative talent, right, that's there. And so the best way for you to see it is for him to compose something or play something or whatever. And in that sense, those articulations, those operative powers come out. And so I would say, in terms of this, like there is a certain level of participation that does happen in this case, right? So, for example, to do a similar sort of analogy, you can see some of my paintings and drawings, paintings behind me. I rotate those out, which ones are back there whenever I do this. But I've done this sort of distinction before when I talk about my philosophy of art, and I do intend on doing a whole episode on my philosophy of art at some point. But I'll talk about sort of the basic sort of metaphysical schematic that I have in mind when I talk about the metaphysics of art, which is that art refers to a certain skill, right? And that skill is something that begins in potential, right? In potentia, right? If you're going to use Latin terms, it's this potential that's within a person, right? So you and every other person who's born who is like a rational animal, a human being, you have a certain potential to learn how to draw or to play music or whatever else. That is a skill in the potential, right? But what happens is through repetition, through rehearsal, through practice, through observation, things like that, you could actually cultivate that and move that potential into actuality. Now that potential skill is a concrete actual skill. It is part of you. It's something that you have. It's built into your ontology. And so now what you have is you can talk about the skill, the art itself, which is that cultivated skill. The artist is one who has cultivated that skill. And then the act, right, of the operation or the essence, or I'm sorry, not the essence, the energies, right, the operative power is the actual activity of doing that, the articulation of that creative skill set which is within you, which ends up producing artwork, right, or artifacts, right, these sort of concrete expressions. And so there's a real sense in which, yes, like those things back there concretize and are, actual sort of, they are artwork, right, or artifacts, this outward articulation of this inner talent that I have. Now, of course, with this, what you have is you actually do have a distinction, right? Those paintings back there, those are actually, they are distinct objects, right? So this is where you do have distinctions, right? You have a distinction between the underlying skill in the abstract and the particular expression. You have a distinction between that underlying skill set and the one who has it. You have a distinction between, the thing into which it is breathed or into like which participates in it, right? So if this were music, right, the instrument itself is in some ways participating in Bach. It is. But the instrument and Bach are two different subjects. But it is actually participating and being energized by Bach in the playing. And so now I think there are degrees of participation, and this is where you get into a bit of a nuance here. Bach, let's say playing a cello, actually is a more direct articulation. It's participating in Bach in a more direct way because he's the actual player. And so this is now like, the skill set is energizing, operating in his own body, right, which is now moving this instrument, and the instrument is now starting to participate, and there's less sort of degrees of removal. I do think in this scenario, what you're talking about is you are still talking about a type of participation, but the difference is there are, further degrees of removal, since like now it's like, well, Bach has deceased, right? And what we have is we have this composition that's left over, which is the artifact, and then you go ahead and you play it and things like that. There's still participation, but I think there is sort of increasing degrees of, removal, as opposed to, when back here, right, like with these paintings or things like that, when they are actually the things being handled by me, there's a more direct participation. But the fact that there's more direct participation doesn't negate the fact that, yeah, you are in some ways participating in Bach's energies, albeit, with some degrees of removal. But I think it would be actually accurate to say, yes, you are. You in some way you are participating in Bach's energies, right? That expression, that outward articulation of his skills and his talent that are sort of reverberating within you, right? In that, which is fascinating. Let's see. What is this next comment? I have no idea if Dr. Jacobs sees this comment. Well, you do now. Um, like I said, I don't see all of them, right? But many of them are sort of ushered my way, and since we do plan to do Q&A episodes like this in the future, or later live Q&A type episodes where we might usher out some posted comments and things like that. Obviously, I am going to see at least some of those. So you want something to make its way to me, go ahead. You hit like, you hit subscribe, you post a comment. All that stuff really helps us out. See, I slipped into my plug there. But yeah, it's possible that I see it. And in this case, well, whoever posted this, yes, I am seeing this comment. So let's see what you have to say. But I have a request. Oh, a request for a podcast episode. Let's see what this is. An overview of logos theology, logos, logoi, skopos, the energies, and how said systems compare and contrast with Thomistic essentialism, substance metaphysics. I've never seen a comparison done, and I can't find an in-depth overview of logos metaphysics, while many exist for Thomism. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that would be a fun episode. Be happy to do something like that. I can sort of go ahead, and for those who are curious, I can give a sort of short version of that here. But yeah, who knows? Maybe we'll do an episode on that. So in terms of logos theology, there's actually a long history to the entire concept of the logos outside. I mean, people who know the New Testament will obviously already recognize logos, right? In the beginning was the Word, right? The logos. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So John's prologue in the New Testament. But the fact of the matter is, there's a long history of logos theology before that. It's not as if John is sort of throwing something out there that's new. And so, like, when you look at as early as the pre-Socratics, right, you already see people like Heraclitus talking about the logos. Now, what does it mean, right? In these early writers, they basically looked out into the world and they recognized that there are rational structures. So this is the proto-realism, where they're like, I actually think what we're seeing is we're seeing meaning and purpose and order and structure and all these sorts of things out there in the world. And since those are mental principles, rational principles, I think the world is actually ordered by something like a mind. And so that got called a number of different things, right? In Heraclitus, it's called logos. I think, if I'm remembering right, I think Anaxagoras is the one who ends up referring to it as nous, as mind, right? Plato very much likes this idea, right? That mind is the explanation of all things. And then nous ends up echoed in later Middle and Neoplatonists as sort of like the rational mind. Within Jewish literature, you actually have, the wisdom literature, those who maybe are only familiar with Proverbs, the book of Proverbs. You'll notice that there's two characters, right? There's God and there's wisdom, this female character, wisdom, who calls out in the streets and all that. Now, you might think, oh, well, that's just anthropomorphism. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot more wisdom literature in ancient Jewish, writings, other than the book of Proverbs. And whenever you look at these things like wisdom of Solomon or wisdom of Sirach or whatever, this character of wisdom always shows up, who is basically there with God and the means by which God makes the world and all this sort of stuff. And that actually ends up being, where Christians see in that, the second person of the Trinity. And they weren't the only ones. So if you look at Alexandrian Judaism, what you see is people like Philo of Alexandria are already talking about, this second principle, this second rational principle that is somehow with God and the means by which God makes the world and so on and so forth. And Philo ends up using the term logos, right? And he even goes on and refers to the logos as deuteros theos, right? Second God. And so anyway, the point is that logos theology in general was the idea that you have sort of God essentially, right? Who he is in his fullness, right? The essence of God, this unbounded, essence. And yet there's a recognition that God is also rational, right? And so the rational mind, right, the intellectual side of God, is this ordering rational principle that gives you these sort of finite articulations, right? The ideas or the forms, the structures of the world and of reality. And so that's one of the reasons why oftentimes there was talk of not just the logos of God or the wisdom of God or the mind of God as some sort of extension of God or deuteros theos, second God or something like that, but also the forms or the ideas, the structures, the architecture of the world was oftentimes always placed within that, right? As if they are the ideas in the mind of God. Now, of course, if you're familiar with Plato, you've heard of the divine ideas, right? The forms and things like that. And this was one of the ways in which later Platonists interpreted Plato's forms, the idea that the reason Plato calls them forms or ideas, right? These archetypes for the structures of the world is because they are ideas in the mind of God. And that's how it played out in a lot of later Platonists. It's also how it played out in Judaism and Christianity. So in Philo of Alexandria, what you end up seeing is he talks about the idea that, an architect before building a city has blueprints or plans, right? And so there was the presumption that within the logos are those designs, right? Those divine ideas. And then within Christianity, you had the same thing. Whether you're talking about in the Latin West, Augustine in his Genesis commentary talks about the same thing, right? The ideas within the logos, within the second person of the Trinity. And then in the Eastern Fathers, you see it too. Now, this is where the logoi, right, which is the plural form of logos, that theology is a sort of further step that's uniquely Christian, and specifically uniquely Christian in the Eastern Fathers, right, in the Christian East. And I think this is a fascinating insight. And you can see I treat this topic actually there's an article I did. If you go to my personal website, nathanajacobs.com, and you go and you look for my refereed articles under my academic tab. One of the things you'll start to see there is one of the articles is called the metaphysical idealism of the Eastern Church Fathers, I think it is, where I sort of comb through their metaphysics, their substance metaphysics, their idealism. And in there, I also treat this doctrine of the logoi. But the logoi is fascinating, right? Because one of the things that emerges in the Eastern Church Fathers is that they end up being forced to develop a philosophy of the individual, of the subject, that Greek philosophy hadn't really contemplated. So what you had amongst the early Greek philosophers, you had the realist nominalist divide, and the atomists and people like that tended toward a high individualism, right? Everything's just a bunch of little idiosyncratic individual atoms that collide around, and there are no sort of groups or structures or things like that, and it's all happenstance. But once philosophy starts to converge around realism and the idea that there are these groups, right? There are universals. You and I share a common nature. There is something common here. You start to get into this philosophy of universals, right? The general noun, the idea of circle, the idea of square, the idea of human, bipedal, dog, cat, all the rest. And so philosophy becomes heavily focused on these common properties, right? On these commonalities. But what's interesting is there's such a focus on that unity, right? The universal, the idea that you and I share a common nature. There was really a lot less being done in terms of developing a philosophy of the individual, like what is an individual and what makes the individual an individual and things like that. And you find certain things on it. There's a minor exploration of it, right? The Stoics talk about whether or not there's certain idiosyncratic properties that make the individual. Aristotle gives a largely negative definition where he's like, well, it's kind of where you run out of predicates, meaning when you run out of general descriptors, general nouns about the thing, that's where you're at this sort of baseline individual something. And so you had different theories, but that was really not the focus of the Greeks, and they didn't really have a clear way of adjudicating those questions of what makes the individual an individual. Whereas within the Eastern Fathers, what's interesting is they're forced, because of the doctrines of Trinity and Christology, to actually develop a philosophy of the individual in a way that hadn't been done before. And this is where, if you've heard of the hypostasis doctrine, right, the idea that the Trinity is one ousia, right, one nature or essence, three hypostases, that is really developed largely because of the doctrine of the Trinity. And that's where you start to get this concept of the underlying individual and a philosophy of the individual. So the Eastern Church Fathers end up insisting that, first of all, the individual is not based in material, right? Because that was one of the theories on the table, that somehow what you have is this discrete lump of matter, right? And that's the thing that gets you an individual. Or like you have generics, the forms, and then when you have an instantiation matter, now you have the material is what gives you, multiple individuals or something like that. And the Eastern Fathers had to remove that from the table, because if we're talking about several hypostases in terms of the Trinity, then it can't be based on matter, right? So it can't be that. In terms of idiosyncratic properties, yes, they actually do suggest that there actually are idiosyncratic properties with regard to the Trinity, right? The Father is the Father of the Son. The Son is the Son of the Father, right? These sorts of relational properties, but there's a recognition that those properties, you need to have two things that relate in order to have that. And so in this sense, right, the subject has to be, in some ways, the individuality of the subject, the discrete subject has to be, sort of beneath even that. So even if there are relational properties that distinguish two things, there have to be two things to relate to have a relational property. And so this is where what you end up finding in the Eastern Fathers is this philosophy where the hypostasis, the subject, is, that sort of underlying, discrete, sort of enduring subject that has certain properties. And this is actually sort of woven into the term hypostasis, right? So the term hypostasis actually has to do with like stasis, stability. And in Basil's Epistle 38, which a lot of people think is Gregory of Nyssa's Epistle 38, but it doesn't matter. I say it doesn't matter because I think they agree. The actual article that first makes that case thinks they do disagree, which is why it cares. But I disagree with the reading of Basil in that, related to, anyway, I won't go down that side road. But suffice to say, whoever wrote Epistle 38 in Basil's corpus, the point is that that's broadly considered to be like the first, articulation of what a hypostasis is. And it essentially asserts a certain form of moderate realism, where it's suggesting that natures are pure abstractions and they have no stasis, right? No stability unless they're concretized in an enduring subject. And so the hypostasis, right, is that thing that is underneath and gives stability to the underlying nature. And so that's what the enduring subject is, right? This concretized, enduring, existent something that has a certain nature and has certain properties and so on and so forth. Now, the reason I bring that up, and anyway, that plays out in how they understand the incarnation, and that's how you can have two natures and one hypostasis, because the hypostasis is not just a sort of phenomena emerging out of properties. It's something that has a nature, has matter, has things like that. And so it can have two natures. Anyway, that plays out in Christology. But for the purpose of this question, the thing that's really important is that with Platonism, the forms or the ideas of God are all generic, right? God has an idea of human, right? And then what happens is matter mirrors what's going on in the forms. And in mirroring what's going on in the forms, you get accidental traits, of this instance of human and that instance of human and things like that. And so there's a sense in which within Platonism, the discrete individual is kind of like a phenomenological accident of the mirroring of the forms. Whereas for the Eastern Fathers, like so many other things they push back against Platonism, they recognize, for example, that God is the creator of matter, whereas in Platonism, God is not the creator of matter. He's the demiurge, the demiurgus. He's the one who crafts or shapes matter to try to mirror the absolute living being. Oh, just as an aside on that, it really sort of got me that on the most important question, I went back and I listened to it and was like, oh, how did I do in this episode? And I noticed that I kept on referring to the cosmic archetype as the most perfect being. That's not what it is. It's the absolute living being. That's what Plato's sort of, cosmic archetype is, right? That unified sort of holistic thing that is composed of the forms, right? The archetype of the cosmos itself, the absolute living being. Anyway, but going back to this. So within Platonism, right, God is just a fashioner, right? He's the demiurge. He's the one who sculpts, replicas of the forms, right, out of matter that's already there. He doesn't create matter. And so with Judaism and Christianity, there's an insistence that, like, no, God makes not just the idea. He doesn't just generate the ideas. He also creates the material, right, that ends up becoming the concrete instantiation of these. But one of the other things that they also started to acknowledge is, now, wait a second, if the individual is actually in some ways a substantial thing, right? If Dr. Jacobs actually is a discrete, not just a sort of accidental transient phenomena, but I actually am a discrete individual with my own ontological, discrete reality beneath the form that gives it stability, and has matter and has nature and has accidents and things like that endures underneath it. If we're going to say the individual, the hypostasis, is in some ways real, right, and substantive, then we have to say that God, is the creator of all things, also creates the individual. And this is where you get the concept of the logoi, right? So the important thing here is that the concept that begins to develop is the idea that God doesn't just generate the idea of generics, human, but he also has an idea of Nathan, right? He has an idea of, Robert. He has an idea of Sam, right? Whatever it is. And so in terms of the architecture, right, of the cosmos, right? Like I talked about Philo of Alexandria saying that God has sort of this architectural blueprint of what he intends to make. The idea that God is provident in some way that actually has to do with space and time and history and things like that means that God doesn't just architect, generics and the individuals are just sort of accidental, phenomena. Instead, the idea is that God decides to make Adam, right? He decides to actually make an instantiation of human, and that involves this, this concrete individual, right? So he is within the logos are all these logoi, all these little words. And incidentally, I trust that why they call them logoi is obvious, but maybe I shouldn't presume that. The point is that because in the Genesis creation account, the idea being that God speaks these things into being, right? Words, that's where they thought, rather than sort of leaning totally into the terminology of ideas, which the Eastern Fathers do use this, right? They'll talk about concepts, they'll talk about ideas, they'll talk about logo. But logos, logoi, this is obviously playing on the speaking side of the Genesis creation story. And so these logoi, right, are all the individual words that are going to be spoken into being to bring about concrete entities. And so the idea here is that, unlike in Platonism, where God just has ideas of generics, instead, for the Eastern Fathers, God has specific ideas. He intends to make you, and he intends to make me. Now, what this also introduces, which is rather fascinating, and this would be a much longer discussion that I cannot bog down this entire Q&A for, is that this ends up meaning that God has a concept of what, me properly formed looks like, and what you properly formed looks like. And this actually plays into their notion of predestination. So the idea that in Christ, I am predestined to become a certain thing. They actually interpret that as, in eternity, God has a concept of me, and not just me in the generic that I'll make this guy and we'll see what happens, but what he intends for me to become, what me as a saint looks like. And that's my predestined end. But this is where what they also introduce is the concept of, like, tropos, right? Movement, a mode of movement, where people like Maximus the Confessor talks about The idea of my movements can be in accord with my logos, right? The idea that God has for me, or I can retreat away from it. And to move in accord with it is to participate in the energies of God, right? Because the logos is an activity, right? His idea of me is an activity, an energy that I can participate in, or I can retreat away from it, and that becomes a mode of corruption. And this is also incidentally how they end up interpreting things like "depart from me, I never knew you." What he's actually saying is, I don't recognize you, right? You have actually made yourself into some distorted thing that is not the thing I created. Right. So anyways, and that's also skopos, like that's purpose, right? That's the term that's being inserted here, as opposed to like teleology. So teleology, I think these sorts of terms in the Eastern Fathers, a lot of it is that they recognize that terms like idea or form and then teleology have an overtly Platonist tendency, and they're in favor of that, right? I am a human. That is my form. That is my idea, right? And there are proper formations that are generic, that are teleological in nature. But then there are unique idiosyncratic things as well, right? Like every saint, as they become what they are made to become, is different, right? Some of them start to look like prophets, right? Some of them look like teachers. Others look like healers. All that sort of stuff. And so that's where the recognition with the logoi is the entire idea that there are also, in addition to the generic teleological ends that we have in common as humans, there are also idiosyncratic ends, right? Idiosyncratic designs for me as Dr. Jacobs. What I look like as a saint is different than what you look like as a saint, which is different than what Athanasius looks like as a saint. Anyway, that's probably I don't want to get bogged down here. I already talked about, I would point to, there was also the question about how this differentiates, this view versus like the Thomist view. I would just, in terms of the essentialism and things like that, I'd point people back to that interview with David Bradshaw, where I actually do lay out the critique that I see as sort of the general critique of medieval scholasticism, where I really think what you see happen is the divine essentialism and simplicity of the Latin West ends up forcing its theology in a direction that I think, and I make the case in that interview, it sort of forces it toward a certain type of necessitarianism, Spinozism, as I call it, where you're really mirroring Spinoza. And I know that the Latin scholastics are trying to avoid that. I just don't think they successfully can. And I draw a contrast there with the notions of divine freedom in the Eastern Fathers, and I talk about second order potentiality and things like that. So I'm going to sort of pull out of this question because I realize I'm about to go into a full podcast episode here just on this topic. And I should probably look at these other comments that we have here. But that's a small glimpse of some of those topics. And we'll go ahead and see if we can carve out time to do a full episode on those sorts of metaphysical topics. Okay. All right. Let's see. Cultural appropriation. All right. Yeah, that my little sort of unexpected episode there. Where I explore whether or not I springboard off of an Instagram post about whether or not like certain people can own a language, and if another people utilize it, whether or not that means they're stealing it and things like that. And so I do a long exposition of rights and examine cultural appropriation from a metaphysical perspective, metaphysician's perspective. And anyway, if you're curious how that goes, you can check that out if you haven't already. So what is this question? I see two comments under here. Is it a performative contradiction for a government to have a natural view of rights, to use fiat currency? Oh, all right. Should a government with a view of natural rights also have a natural currency? I don't know. Right. That's the I don't know is actually in the comment that I'm reading. That's an interesting comment, right? So just by way of context, in that episode, I end up talking about rights, right? And I talk about the natural view of rights versus a positivist view of rights. And here I use sort of as just sort of basic illustration of that, I end up contrasting John Locke on the one hand with Thomas Hobbes on the other. And so this is sort of in terms of modernity, this is common sort of bifurcation there, where John Locke thinks that rights are natural things, right? They have to do with sort of relations. In most of them are property oriented, but these sort of relational properties, like if I somehow have acquired the skill set in order to make artwork, and I make a painting like that back there, there's a relational property between me and that object, such that it is the production of my labor, it's the articulation, the concrete instantiation of my skill sets, and so on. And so for that reason, it's meaningful to say it is, my painting or my artwork or something like that. And so that's where it's like those sorts of relations are the things that Locke thinks ground and make meaningful the idea that it is mine to do with as I please. And that's why I can sell it, right, in exchange for something else that belongs to somebody else for some reason, whether it's money that they've somehow earned, or it's some other object that they've produced, for example. And so anyway, I go through this sort of natural view of rights that's there. And then I contrast that with a positivist view of rights, such as what you find in Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes has a very bleak view of reality in general, where he actually suggests that rights are the only right is the only natural right is the right to whatever you can take. And so he actually says, like, if I can take your stuff, it belongs to me. He even says scandal, like, I mean, shockingly, right? Like, even if I can take your body, it belongs to me. So Hobbes basically has this sort of state of nature view where it's, the state of nature is a struggle, right? It's war, it's power. And so basically, might makes right in a certain way, or makes rights, we could say, with regard to Hobbes. And so anyway, I draw a distinction between those sorts of things. And I basically make the case, and that's the context for this comment. I suggest that the U.S., founding is rooted in a natural view of rights. And I point this out, Declaration of Independence with regard to inalienable rights. You can't talk about inalienable rights unless you have a natural view of rights. And then also, I think it's the Ninth Amendment that talks about, broad summary here, but it talks about like the idea that the people have certain rights not here enumerated and they retain those rights. You can't say that as a positivist, right? So for somebody like Hobbes, rights are governmental inventions, right? So even though if you're capable of breaking in and taking my stuff, you have a right to it, according to Hobbes, because he doesn't have a natural view of rights. You and I can enter into some sort of social contract, and we can hand over our natural rights, which is power, over to the government, and we can basically enter into contract that says, I'm not going to trample on your flowers if you don't trample on mine. I won't take your stuff if you don't take mine. And if I transgress that, then this other third party, the government, that we both submitted to, which is big and scary and, all the rest, will come in and punish whichever one of us violated the contract. And that's kind of the positivist view of rights. They're governmental inventions. And that's why I said, like, for somebody like Locke, you actually have to offer some sort of demonstration of some sort of order of nature or natural relation or something like that to claim that you have a right, right? Parental rights make sense because of the sort of the order of nature with regard to the fact that this child is produced, by your union. With regard to property, like with regard to art or something like that, that makes sense. Even intellectual property, which gets a little dicier, but still it being somehow a product of the person's intelligence and ingenuity and whatever else. These sorts of things can give some sort of natural relation demonstration for why they exist. Whereas for a positivist, you can just make up rights, and you can make rights go away, because they're governmental inventions, right? If the government says you have a right to, free college, and it's going to somehow enforce that, then you do. And then if it changes its mind and that goes away, you don't, right? And so I think the context here for this is asking a very interesting question, which is there some sort of inherent contradiction in the idea of having a natural view of rights, but not a natural view of currency? Yeah, my inclination is to say yeah. I mean, I suppose in some sense we can this goes into a certain area of realism, which I talk about a lot in here, which realists don't actually suggest that there are no constructs, right? So one of the things that sometimes happens when people start to hear about realism, they go, well, okay, so all the generic properties and all the common groups and all the general nouns, those are real. So what about a table, right? That's not, is that also real and things like that? And they'll usher out some sort of construction, right? Like analogy, right? That I invented this widget and I call it a widget, right? And so, are you suggesting that somehow that exists in the mind of God and in the forms? And it actually depends, right? Plato kind of leans towards yes. There actually does seem to be in Plato an indication that all the generics do have some sort of archetypal root. Whereas Aristotle draws a distinction between art and nature. And here, what he's suggesting is yes, there are such things as extrinsic teleology that we can impose on things, right? Like with a fork, for example, the nature of the thing is metal, right? If we're talking about a metal fork. And we've sort of shaped it in a way that's useful for picking up food and eating, but you could also use it as a weapon. You could use it, to stick into a cork and open up a bottle or something like that. And that's the sort of thing you get like in The Little Mermaid, right, where Scuttle all of a sudden is talking about a snarfblat or a dinglehopper or whatever, and it's all funny because that's not what that thing is for. But the fact of the matter is, like, it's true. Like, there is no innate teleology. There's no sort of internal nature to that metal that says it is for forking, right? But that's not true with regard to an eye. It's not that the eye happens to be sort of broadly useful for seeing, but it's just as good for ping ponging or something like that. Like, there actually is clearly an innate nature to it that's driving it forward into a certain formation that has as its end to see. And so Aristotle draws this distinction between art and nature in the sense that nature has these sort of innate structures where the form has a pretty obvious and clear teleology to it, a certain end to it, whereas we can come up with artifacts, right? Things that we construct and we impose from the outside a certain utility on them. And so I will say this. I am more on Aristotle's side in this discussion than I am on Plato's. So I do grant the art nature distinction. And so I don't think just because one has a certain natural view of this or that, right, that means there's no room for social constructs, right? I don't think that means that all of a sudden you can't also have certain extrinsically imposed widgets or gadgets or something like that you can't come up with certain conventions that you as a culture agree on or something like that. I think those things can be violated without violence to nature because they are constructions. But I don't think that just because you grant that there are certain orders to nature, that means that you can't also create room for social conventions. So, is it the case that currency, somebody who has a natural view of rights, you can't also have, a sort of positivist view of currency or a fiat view of currency? I think the answer here is, sort of just feeling this out here on the fly. My inclination would be this. On the one hand, I don't think there's an inherent contradiction in saying that we have a natural view of this thing over here and a fiat or a positivist view of this thing over here. That in itself, I don't think necessitates a contradiction. However, the question, and I do think this is a legitimate question, and I don't know that I have time to explore it in full, but there is a question of whether or not any of the conventions violate the natural order. So part of the issue here is that when you're talking about sort of natural views of currency, are you talking about, is there already a certain view of currency, right, that naturally emerges out of the natural view of rights, right, such as the fact that, I created those paintings. I have some sort of relation. They are in some sense mine. And then with that, there emerges the capacity to gift them or to sell them, transfer ownership and things like that. I think that does mean that within the order of nature, there is a certain concept of currency that's already there. And so what I would say is, as long as the fiat view of currency isn't violative of the order of nature, then it wouldn't be a contradiction. But I think figuring out how violative it is or is not is probably a little dicier. It rolls off the tongue so easy, but actually investigating it and determining a fiat view of currency that doesn't violate the order of nature might be a little more difficult than a little easier said than done, right? So there you go. It's an interesting question, fun one to explore, I'm sure. Okay, we've got one more under cultural appropriation. Forgive my drinking of my coffee here. Okay, so connected with the idea of rights, how might a patent fit in? Looks like intellectual property. I said, I was like, yeah, that's a more complicated thing. Looks like we're stepping into it here. If I patent a certain way of making pottery, to use your metaphors, and I did use that metaphor, and then it seems that I hold the right over the abstract idea. Okay, I'm going to have to give context to this, but of that particular type of pottery, even if you buy the pottery and reverse engineer it, it would be a violation of my right. Perhaps patents are not actually rights to begin with. And so that's, maybe so. But if we allow that a patent enables one to own not merely a pot, but the particular structure and manufacturing of all pots of that form, does that open the door to the designer having rights over the abstract rather than merely his own particular pottery? Okay, so the context for this is when I started to explore certain sort of relations, right, between, products, things that somebody might create, right, artifacts somebody might produce, and their innate, sort of skill set, right? This was all sort of based on this art, right, skill set, artist, artifact sort of thing. And I started talking in that context about the relationship between the artist and the artifact and so on. One of the things that I pointed out here is that ownership seems to extend to the particular, not to the abstract. So, for example, if I'm the first one to figure out how to do glaze painting, and I do that, I can in some ways be credited as the first person to discover that, but my ownership sort of ceases with the object itself. And I make the case in there that basically somebody else who is a rational being, who is also an artist, who observes what I did and sort of reverse engineers it and figures out how to glaze paint themselves and starts to, do their own glaze painting and things like that, they haven't stolen from me, right? Because they have an innate right as a rational being to utilize their own skill sets, their own wisdom, their own observation skills in order to observe, reverse engineer, and learn from that, right? That's actually an innate right that they have, based on their ontology, right, on their being as rational beings. And so I can't claim that they've stolen from me. They take my painting, I can say they've stolen from me, but the abstract, deconstruction of what I've done and the learning from it is not actually stealing. So this is an interesting issue here, right? Because what it's getting into is it's getting into the questions of whether patents in some ways are extensions of rights, or whether or not in some ways they ironically might overstep rights. And I think there's actually an interesting parallel here with the currency question, because I had pointed out that on the one hand, it's fine for there to be, right, both on the one hand, sort of a natural view of, let's say, rights and a fiat view of currency, so long as that fiat view of currency doesn't violate the natural order of currency, right? Well, there's something similar here, right? So I think it's fine to have laws. I actually do think there is to a certain extent, there are, certain types of intellectual property. J.K. Rowling actually does own, Harry Potter. And here, this is what's sort of interesting and fascinating, just as an aside. In the ancient world, what's fascinating is so much of the ancient world, the first question with regard to an idea, Plato says this about the forms. And the big question was, is it true? Like that was the first thing they wanted to know. And then the second question was, did anybody else figure that out? Right. And that's one of the reasons why in the ancient world, they don't tend to indigenize ideas the way we do. Right. So in our contemporary culture, we have a tendency to think if there's a similarity between Plato and this Egyptian myth, that must mean that there was direct contact at some point. As opposed to the way the ancient world thinks, where it's like there just is a reality out there. And then if Plato, through the use of reason, discerned a certain order of reality, it's entirely possible that this person over here, unconnected, disconnected from Plato, no contact with Plato, could discern the same fabric that's there. Probably the closest analog we still have in our thinking for this is mathematics, right? You wouldn't say, well, my goodness, people in China figured out, arithmetic, and people in Australia, the people from Australia must be from China. Like you wouldn't say that because you'd be like, well, arithmetic is just sort of there. Like you can discern it, right? It's part of reality. And that's a lot of how the ancient world thought about things. So the interesting thing is Plato can't own the theory of the forms if it's true. If it's false, he can. Right? Because if it's false, then it is a fabrication of his own mind. And so this is what's interesting, right? Like Leibniz can't own calculus, right? Because calculus has, Newtonians. I'm crediting Leibniz for the discovery of calculus. Anyway, that's an inside bit. Newton, Leibniz basically discovered in the same week. Newton gets credit. Anyway, whatever. Put enough of that aside. So the point is like Leibniz can't own calculus, right? It's something he discovers. But J.K. Rowling can own Harry Potter. That actually is a fabrication, right? There actually is a certain sub-creation happening there when she sort of fabricates and invents this. And so I do think there is such thing as intellectual property. I do think there is such thing as things that can be the product of creative genius, right? Of innovation and things like that. But then there's this weird part when it comes to discovery. Right. And I think discovery gets into the strange territory because I think on the one hand, it's a natural sort of human trait to go ahead and celebrate and acknowledge, discovery. And I think there is a part of me, and maybe this is too much of the American culture influencing me, but I am inclined to think that the idea of somebody being rewarded for innovation, for insight, that there is something suitable to that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the patent system is the best way to reward them, but certainly the patent system is meant to, in some ways, do that. Now, the question is, though, that is the patent system in trying to acknowledge and reward innovation and creativity and things like that, simultaneously actually violating a certain right? And I think the answer is maybe. I think it might be because as I made the case in there, reason and intelligence gives an innate right to actually reverse engineer, to observe, to reverse engineer, to correct something, to learn from that thing and to apply it, right, in some way. And so I think what's interesting is that I think the patent system does in some ways hinder sort of the innate capacity of another person to reverse engineer an insight, to utilize it, to apply it, and then in some ways actually benefit from their own insight, their own labor, and all the rest. So this actually is an area where I think it's not necessarily currency, but it is stepping into that same sort of territory that the currency question asked, which is to say, like on the one hand, products of your labor, right, developments of your own genius, things like that, these are sort of natural extensions that you can sort of profit from and have ownership over and so on, but there are limits. And does the patent system in its attempt to, in some ways, like protect not just credit, but sort of impose a restrictive ownership on something, violate other people's rights who have the capacity to reverse engineer, to observe, reverse engineer, and apply it in their own right? And I think the answer is maybe. So that's an interesting That's an interesting observation, interesting question there. We've got a couple more. Let's see. These are related to the demise of the West. So that was the Dugan interview. Let's see. And this is actually the last round of comments for today. I'm recording this on the day where the interview with Chris Firestone, the Myth of Enlightenment, I think is what the episode's called, just dropped. And so I don't seem to have any comments in here that are prompted by that episode, maybe because it just dropped this morning. But anyway, so this is going to be the last round of comments that I'm looking at here. So the demise of the West. Let's see. Love this podcast. Great. Thank you. I'm glad. It's a lot of work, so I'm glad you like it. So love this podcast. Question for Doc J. If Christians all held to realism, would they no longer feel the need to do evidentialist apologetics? Oh, this is interesting. Okay. So evidentialist apologetics, this is the sort of thing, for people don't know, this is largely historical in orientation, right? So this is the sort of thing where it's like, well, we're going to look at archaeological evidence that the Exodus really happened, or we're going to look for archaeological evidence that not only did Jesus really exist, but that he was in these places, that the gospel accounts are are accurate. Here's our proof for making the case that he really rose from the dead, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's true that evidentialist apologetics in the empiricist age, in modernity, became much more prominent, right? So people like John Locke offer a very sort of an evidentialist. His book, The Reasonableness of Christianity, is basically an evidentialist apologetics, but you also find in other people like Bishop Berkeley in that sort of modernist turn. And then contemporary evangelicalism, a lot of their apologists tend to be evidentialists in orientation. I don't think that there is a strict divide between evidentialism and realist approaches. So it's true that realism offers a whole host of ways of sort of reasoning to God and seeing the world and things like that, that doesn't require a bunch of archaeological or historical or manuscript sort of oriented evidence, right? And actually in my upcoming podcast, Why I'm a Realist, I go ahead and I make the case for why not only do I think realism is true, but why I think realism is inevitable, why I think it requires belief in God, and why I actually think once you start to see that and recognize that, not only does atheism become untenable, it becomes incoherent. So a little teaser for you there. But I don't think evidentialism, I don't think realism and the sort of like a priori arguments that you might level, or, if they're even a priori, I don't think those sorts of arguments, metaphysical arguments that you get there, have to be sort of, I don't think we have an either or, right? Where you either have to have these sort of metaphysically oriented cases or you have evidentialist cases. I think both are perfectly valid. Now, there is a tendency to sometimes, and I think this is actually a modernist tendency. I don't think this is an ancient tendency, and I'll explain why. But I think in modernity, you start to get a rationalist empiricist bent, and the rationalists kind of become the sort of de facto realists. So in that, in that dichotomy in modernity, what you end up having is people like Leibniz and others who really start to suggest that the real problem you have is that that descriptive, historical, a posteriori, right, based on the senses, sort of information doesn't really contain an explanation. This sort of goes to Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. And so the problem is, like, people like Leibniz suggest, like, you can sit here and you can descriptively talk about certain physical laws, and you can give the impression that those have some sort of necessity to them by calling them laws. But in reality, there's no contradiction and objects tending up rather than down, or, things not sinking when they're on water versus them sinking. And, like, you can talk about principles of buoyancy or whatever, But really, at the end of the day, you're just describing a certain state of affairs. You're not actually explaining anything. This is critical to Leibniz's entire philosophy. And so he actually suggests, he ends up concluding that a lot of these sort of descriptive, sort of scientific realities, historical realities, actually lack explanation, right? And what you need is you need to trace those to something that actually does offer some sort of metaphysical, logical necessity to it. And so with Leibniz, he ends up suggesting that every historical event, every scientific law, all these sorts of things always have this lack of a sufficient reason for being so until you trace all of them back to their origin, which is in God. And then basically God being a being who, if you understand what he is, you understand that he exists. That's sort of Leibniz playing on the ontological argument, or his version of the ontological argument. And then also, if you understand that he's the optimal being, then you understand that he also does things in the optimal way. And so basically, if you understand what God is, then you understand that anything he does is the best. And therefore, our world is the best of all possible worlds. And the principle of the best ends up grounding all the other sort of contingencies that follow from that. Anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down in explaining Leibniz. You can read my Leibniz book, which is coming out from Routledge, if you want a full treatment of Leibniz on these topics. But my point is simply this. Leibniz and the rationalist tradition within modernity really wants to suggest that all the empiricist stuff, all the descriptive stuff, all the a posteriori, for those who don't know these terms, a priori, apart from experience, a posteriori, based on experience. So 2 + 2 = 4. A priori, you understand the terms, you understand that follows. A posteriori, how many people are in my kitchen? Well, I'd have to go look, and there's no necessity to the answer. If it's one person today and it's 2 people tomorrow, there's no contradiction. A posteriori. So the dichotomy that starts to emerge in modernity is you've got one group of people who are really, really pounding these rational a priori truths, right? People like Leibniz and Spinoza. And then on the other hand, you have these sort of empiricist folks who are going with these highly descriptive a posteriori laws of motion, laws of physics, empirical observation, and so on. And that's kind of the modern war, right? Like, which truths really matter, which ones really explain things, and so on. And so that's where you start to get this divide, right? Where on the one hand, you have one group that's saying, like, here's how we prove things about God. And it ends up with these a priori analytic arguments. And then on the other hand, you have this other group that's saying, well, the real truths are truths that we observe and taste and touch and test, empirical sciences. And so they start to move more toward these historical proofs and things like that. I think that's really a modern dichotomy. And the reason I say that is because on the one hand, if you look back in early Christianity, take somebody like Origen of Alexandria. So Origen, very important early Christian thinker. He's not a church father, but he is a very, very well-respected early Christian thinker, very philosophical early Christian thinker, very well trained in philosophy. And so on the one hand, in Origen, you find a lot of the sort of realist bent to reason about God in the way that somebody like Plato might, right? But on the other hand, you also have Origen, when dealing with certain skeptics, telling them, like, go check the records, right, regarding Jesus's crucifixion, right? And so he's making, he actually is making, historical cases also about the records themselves, about documents, about, historical evidentialist type proofs for those things. So I think those things are, I think that dichotomy is really sort of a modernist phenomenon. And I think when we find ourselves saying, well, I think I've got to choose, do I either go with analytic proofs or I go with evidentialist, historical proofs or things like that? I think we're just showing ourselves to be children of the Enlightenment. And I don't think there has to be a strict dichotomy. I don't see anything wrong with going ahead and offering an analytic argument regarding some truth about God. I don't mind offering some transcendental type argument like Kant does regarding morality. I don't mind looking at historical records to see whether or not certain documents or stories are accurate. I don't see any reason why those things have to be sort of pitted against each other. Now, I will say this. One of my main problems with evidentialist apologetics, and I say this not as a critique of the entire enterprise, but I will say this. Within sort of the evidentialist enterprise, one of the main places that a lot of evangelicals go, like people like William Lane Craig and others, Josh McDowell and whatever else in that sort of evangelical vein of things, they tend to heavily focus on the resurrection of Jesus Christ and trying to demonstrate that the records are reliable, that he was crucified, that he died, and that he was buried, that his apostles claim to have seen him raised from the dead, that they went to their death saying that he rose from the dead, and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's all. I think there's lots of compelling stuff there. I think it's very interesting stuff to look at. And I think that's a worthy enterprise. But here's the problem that I've always had with that. One of the main problems I have with that is that it treats the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the litmus test of it as a purely historical litmus test. Back then, was there this thing that happened? Did he get up out of the grave? Did people see him, et cetera, et cetera? But the fact of the matter is, and now I'm speaking from a theological vantage point as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, the entire notion that Christ rose from the dead within Eastern Orthodox theology is that he is a conqueror of death, right? That this, if you understand sort of the Eastern Orthodox understanding of the gospel, the incarnation has as its purpose to enter humanity in order to heal it, in order to restore our nature, in order to set it right, in order to defeat death and to communicate to it the divine energies and make us incorruptible and offer us a means by which, through imitation and participation, we too can put off corruption for incorruption, death for no death or immortality, and so on and so forth. And so the fact of the matter is, like, it's interesting. It's an interesting historical exercise, what's going on there. But the real question is, did it work, right? Because what should happen is if Christ is who he said he is, and if his entrance, right, if he really is the Son of God who entered humanity and healed us and defeated death and things like that, what should happen is the production of saints. There should be other people who end up experiencing a restored and vivified humanity that, really sort of starts to mirror the resurrected Christ, right? And this is why I actually think one of the more important proofs for the incarnation and the resurrection of Christ is actually the life of the saints. To look at people like an Elder Paisios and read about his life and talk to the people who met him and saw him, transfigured, who experienced healings from him and things like that. And there are countless stories like that throughout the history of Christianity. And that's where I think hagiography, the lives of saints, right, the study of saints, is one of the more important proofs, because the fact of the matter is a proper understanding of resurrection from a New Testament perspective actually would indicate not just that it's like one guy way back when got out of a grave. Resurrection in the New Testament actually is metamorphosis. It is the defeat of death. It's the putting off of corruption for incorruption. It's a transformation of the individual where they are now immortal. It's not just reanimation. And it has as its purpose that other people participate in that as well. And that's why I think the more important proof is, well, has it worked, right? And the lives of the saints, I think, are one of the greatest proofs of that. So there you go. Okay, let's see. What else do we have? Great video. Thank you. You're welcome. But for me, transhumanism is not so easy to stop. Okay. My English is not good enough. Oh, for shame. That looks great so far. So I attach a video about transhumanism from a Christian/Catholic perspective that impressed me very much. I mean, for somebody whose English isn't good, like, this is pretty good. Obviously, I'm not going to have a chance to watch this video here. I'm reading this on the fly. I'd like to point to a special thought. Okay, let's see. Does not transhumanism start with any medical treatment that is adding an artificial element, a hip replacement, a new heart, any prosthetic, I think is what that is. Let's see. Is this not the entrance that already happened that which which we cannot resist, not so much a demonic transsexual to transhuman development, but a humanistic first step for health, for optimizing. Any beauty treatment, which does not change your gender, but still the really. Okay, so I suppose part of this is where there is a certain maybe a language barrier. I would be curious what it means by not so easy to stop, right? So what I can't tell is whether this is meant to be a defense of transhumanism by means of saying, well, we already do these other things, and don't freak out about those. You don't worry about hip replacement, so why about gender transition surgery or something like that? What I can't tell is if it's saying like it's making a case for transhumanism through that, or it's saying like, haven't we already opened the door to that a long time ago? What I will say is this: there are a couple of different things going on here. One of those is the question of whether or not the thing is in keeping with the teleological end of the thing, right? So let's talk about a hip replacement, right? Let's talk about, I don't know details about how hip replacements are done, but my very simplistic understanding of what it is that there has been either some sort of break or deterioration where the hip is having trouble, the bone is having trouble structurally supporting the body the way it is meant to. And that language is intentional. And so we're going to, in some ways, open up the body in order to go in and provide some sort of support for it, whether it's an overlay or a replacement of some part or whatever, in order to help facilitate it to do what it's supposed to do. Now, there is a stark contrast here between what I just described and hacking apart a penis and inverting it up inside the person so that it looks like a vagina. Okay, and the reason I say that is that the difference should be evident. On the one hand, the one procedure actually has to do with a certain corruption that is setting in, right? The hip is somehow failing, it's deteriorating, it's having trouble supporting the body the way it is intended to, right? Its teleological end. And the procedure is here trying to actually provide some sort of support to enable it to go ahead and fulfill its purpose, given the fact that it's starting to fail, in that, because corruption and death is setting in. So here what's interesting is this procedure is actually aimed at preserving and fulfilling the teleological end of the thing. It's coming in as an undercurrent of support to its innate nature, right? So the hip has a certain purpose. It has fulfilled that purpose, and now due to whatever it is, age, deterioration, death, it is starting to have trouble fulfilling that purpose. And this is an attempt to provide support to enable the body to do the thing that is already meant to do. Now, there's a great difference between that and, say, a penis, which is being hacked apart, and now you're actually violating its purpose. You're making it non-functional. It's no longer capable of fulfilling its purpose with regard to reproduction and things like that. You're actually mutilating it in a way that's violative of its purpose. And so this is where, like, the main big thing, I think the thing is that what you're having here is that the question is in some ways suggesting that the main problem with transhumanism, which is actually more extreme, but let's just say trans, right, is that there's some violence being done to the body or something like that, or that there's some external substance, right, material being used on the body or something like that. And there may be some level of overlap in that sense, right? You're talking about a medical procedure, and the medical procedure involves bringing into play some sort of foreign material into the body. Okay, yeah. There is overlap in that sense, but the difference here is that the one is actually aimed at upholding and affirming and supporting the teleological end of the thing, the body, as it's designed to do, and the other is actually overtly violating it. The other thing that's also happening is it's not just violating it, it's actually attempting to make it something else. Now, as a realist, I don't think you can. You can hack apart a penis and try to make it look like a dog. It's not going to be a dog. It's a hacked apart penis. So I actually think the innate nature is what it is, right? I don't think it's actually possible to change it into something else, but that's what you're trying to do, right? So here, what you're actually doing is when you're talking about that type of transformational effort, what you're actually doing is you're both violating the teleology of the thing, you're undermining its functionality, and you're trying to make it into something that it is not. Whereas the other one, you're actually acknowledging its proper function, and you're recognizing a certain deficit that's starting to set in, a certain deterioration, and you're trying to come in order to help and to support it. Now, I will say that, like the sort of medical procedure and things like that, the violence to the body, and the insertion of foreign materials and things like that actually is a violation of nature. That is true, right? But I think here, this is where the doctrine of double effect comes in. And anyway, that would be a whole ethics podcast. I plan to do an ethics podcast with James Joyner and so on. And so I think there are certain conditions under which, surgery under the doctrine of double effect, which you can look that up, would actually make sense as a justifiable thing. And so anyway, we can talk about that in the ethics podcast, but in terms of just this whole like trans thing, whether you're talking about a full transhumanism or transgenderism or something like else, I think that's the main categorical distinction. It's, yes, they have the commonality that both involve surgery and foreign, agents or something like that. But the one is actually aimed at preserving and upholding the teleology and the integrity of the thing, whereas the other is violating it and actually trying to change it into something else. As for transhumanism, though, that part that I talked about, that's actually something much, much beyond, right? That's trying to cast off not just a part of your body and, transition into a different gender. That's actually trying to transcend the full limits. And that's where I suggested that transhumanism ultimately has as its end, this type of virtual reality thing and so on. But anyway, you can look at that. That's more extreme. But I think for this basic question, that distinction will probably suffice. Okay, last comment, last question, and then we'll wrap it up here. Of course, the area this classical view falls apart is the totalitarian desire to dictate the boundaries of what is good, and more importantly, what classical thinking would define as distorted. It can't be upheld without authoritarianism. So this is actually a rather ironic comment, right? So I gather that the person leveling this is probably someone who actually is not an advocate of classical anthropology, is not an advocate of realism, probably has nominalist tendencies. And ironically, as I've pointed out, leftism and nominalist empiricism has these sort of authoritarian tendencies to it. And the reason is because it doesn't actually have an order of nature to appeal to, right? So with regard to, realists, classical views, there actually are certain order, there's a certain order of nature. You believe the order of nature is real. You believe relational properties between like me and my artwork are real. And in this sense, you can discern what, is right and wrong, what innate rights are, what the good of a thing is, and so on. Whereas when you're a nominalist, all of those things are just fabricated, right? They're all just social constructs. And for that reason, there is an authoritarian tendency to them. And, kind of ironically, but it does start to sort of evolve or devolve into Nietzscheanism, where there's just a struggle of power and things like that. And I do talk about that in The Demise of the West. I talk about the most important question. But the fact of the matter is, I don't believe this in the least. I think it's quite evident that the purpose of an eye is to see. I think it's quite evident just from the nature of a lung that its purpose is to oxygenate, the blood in the body. I think it's quite evident just from the nature of a heart that its purpose is to pump blood and circulate it throughout the body. I don't think we have to pretend that those things are difficult to discern. So the fact of the matter is, from the classical view, it's not authoritatively imposed, right? The claim is not that, the purpose of a heart is to pump blood because I say so, and anybody who disagrees is wrong. No, the classical view is actually aimed at trying to discern the patterns of nature so that it can say, well, this is the order of things, and this being what it is, this is the obvious end of the thing, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these sort of classical views, they're observational in nature, right? It's like, well, what does the digestive system do? And incidentally, this is the sort of thing that science does too. I was sort of one of the ones that and there's a show that my kids used to watch, called Dinosaur Train. I'm probably dating myself here a little bit. I don't know if the show's even on, but it's interesting. Like Dinosaur Train, like they'd have these different dinosaurs, as you might expect. And at the end of the show, after you met these different dinosaur characters, there would oftentimes be paleontologist Steve, I think it was, who would come out at the end, and he'd be like, "Hey, I'm paleontologist Steve. Kids, today on the show we met the whatever-whatever-asaurus," right? And he'd always point out something interesting, right? Like the whatever-whatever-asaurus has a strange shape on top of its head, this strange bone. And what do you think that bone's there for, kids? Well, and then he would go on and say, well, some people think it's hollow, so they think maybe it could blow air out and it could make noises. And anyway, he provides an explanation. Funny thing is, what paleontologist Steve never said was no reason at all, kids. It's just a random mutation that's totally pointless and purposeless because the world has no meaning and no structures, and you should all just go kill yourself. Paleontologist Steve never said that, right? Instead, he, like all other scientists, presume that when you're like, well, why do plants have leaves? There is a discernible purpose to those, right? Photosynthesis, something like that. And so the realist view, when it's talking about the order of nature, it actually does offer some sort of rational assessment. It begins with observation. And it's saying, okay, here is the structure. What is the point and the purpose of that structure in the thing? And that's an actual investigation of the order in nature. It's not merely an imposed thing. So the fact of the matter is, this entire notion that somehow it's just an imposed purpose or something like that, it misunderstands the entire nature of the discussion. Right now, if you're a positivist with regards to rights, then yes, when it comes to rights, it's all going to be just a struggle for power. Who can get the government to give them or take away whatever rights they want given or taken away? If you are a utilitarian who doesn't believe in certain sort of universal moral principles, and you think it's all just about what creates general happiness and things like that, you might be inclined to think that all of this is just like whose social conventions, whose values can we impose on the rest of the people, because you don't actually believe in moral norms. And it's that sort of that lack of belief in universals, that lack of belief in real structures of the world. Those, for that reason, because there is no groundedness, there is no sort of discernible structure that you can look at, observe, dissect, and from that discern the order of things and therefore the good of things, it does have a default tendency toward a certain authoritarianism. And that is the way nominalism ends up sort of going. It's one of the reasons why it ultimately ends up in these sort of things like Nietzscheanism, for example, which I talk about in The Most Important Question and also in The Demise of the West. But from a classical view, that's actually not true. The classical view is recognizing that I am beholden to certain structures of reality. And so it's asking the question, right? It has discernible ways of doing this. So, for example, just within Aristotle, right, he presumes that each species of thing, how you define a species, right, is that you identify its genera and its specific difference. For example, man, this is where you get man as a rational animal, right? So animal being the genera. The specific difference that sets man apart from the other animals is rationality. And so for that reason, what Aristotle suggests is that somehow rationality must be intimately tied to the teleological end of the thing. But that's actually the point, right? That is that Aristotle is suggesting that somehow he's not just sort of declaring by fiat that reason has an important role to play. What he's observing is that in nature, it's the specific difference, the thing that sets it apart as unique, right? My eyes have certain things in common with my teeth, right? Or with my lungs, right? So, but the thing that tells you the purpose of an eye is the thing that sets it apart as unique, right? The question is not just what does my eye have in common with, my lungs or my fingers, right? Okay, they, both have animal cells, right? And so they both have Golgi bodies or whatever it is, right? Like that doesn't tell you the purpose of an eye. You start to burrow down into its teleology when you start to ask what sets it apart as different. And so that's where you go, okay, well, the eye is for seeing, the ear is for hearing, right? The tongue is for tasting, and saliva for breaking things down, and so on and so forth. It's the specific difference that starts to orient you toward the teleological end. And so that's one of the reasons why with Aristotle, reason is more important to discerning the order of, the purpose of humanity than the fact that you have fingernails, right? Something like that. And so there actually was a procedural order, a point of orientation, right? Observation about the world in order to discern what the structures were so that you could discern what the purpose of those structures were so that you could figure out your place in the world. And from figuring out your place in the world, submit to the world. So the irony is authoritarianism actually is top down, right? It's me imposing by fiat on other people or on whatever it is, right? This thing, it's top down. Whereas really, the classical view is much more a submissive view. It's that I am looking at the order of nature. I'm woven into the fabric of nature. So I'm woven into reality. So the question is, what is the order of reality? Where do I sit within that reality? And then based on my nature and my place within the cosmic order, what does that tell me about what is good and right for me? What is my purpose here? And so it's actually submissive, right? It's inherently placing me under the authority of reality and nature itself. And the exercise of observing reality is for the purpose of figuring out what is my purpose, right? What is the order of nature and what is my purpose within it? So it's actually entirely contrary to authoritarianism. But it actually, in the case of empiricism and nominalism, that does naturally start to turn into a form of authoritarianism precisely because it doesn't think there are structures to reality to which it is beholden, right? All of it is social construction. It originates with us. And because it originates with us, we go ahead and exercise authority in imposing, social norms, moral norms, cultural norms, and all the rest. So it seems like there's probably a little bit of construction projection going on in this sort of comment where this person probably does have nominalist tendencies and they're projecting on they're basically seeing themselves in a state of war, right, against the classical view. But the classical view really is not an authoritarian view, right? It's ultimately a view that's looking out and trying to submit to nature. It's trying to discern the order of nature in order that it might submit to it. It's not imposing it on nature. So anyway, there you go. Well, there we go. That wraps up our first comment and question session here. So we'll have more of these in the future, and hopefully what will happen is we will soon, in the not-so-distant future, we will be doing some of these live and taking your comments and your questions live. So be watching for that. And in the meantime, just keep on liking those videos, sharing those videos, following, subscribing, and posting comments and questions and the like. And who knows, maybe yours will show up on one of these Q&A podcasts. So there you have it. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.